I'm very pleased is here, is Katherine Quarmby, who a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now? 2 years ago, wrote the book Scapegoat, which really was the first attempt to try and understand why there were all these murders of disabled people taking place across this country at the hard end of disability hate crime, and many, many more attacks. And really, due to Katherine and a few other people's work, we did get the Commission of Inquiry from the Equality Human Rights Commission, and even an undertaking from the government to do something about it. And at least now, disability hate crime is being recorded, if it's massively underrepresented. But I've asked Katherine to reflect a little bit on that experience, but also to go back a bit into the things that she talked about in the book. Because if you scratch beneath the surface, there are some very strange ideas that the mass of people hold about disabled people. So Katherine, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's really good to be here again. I think I've been to 1 or 2 years now, because I think I've been running for 3 years, and it's great to see it kind of multiplying around the country and seeing these events grow in number. And thank you, Richard and Susie, as well, for all the work, the hard work that you do, to organise this. I was thinking about what I think about disability this year, and I was thinking about Charles Dickens and Tale of Two Cities, and I'm sure lots of you know the opening line of it, which was, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And it kind of feels like that this year. We had the amazing Paralympics, and suddenly the mainstreaming of disabled people on TV in a way I don't think we've ever seen before in this country. And my son, who actually hasn't got a disability, said to me when we went to the wheelchair basketball final, "Can I do this sport?" And I think for a lot of young non-disabled people, for the first time they realised that disabled sport was really cool. And I think it's these kind of tiny micro steps that make such a difference. And a Channel 4 poll at the end of the Paralympics said that the extensive coverage, around 2/3 of the people they surveyed, had affected their attitudes towards disabled people in a positive way. And yet at the same time, that's the good news. We're kind of living through the worst of times. We had this paradox this year because we also, there's a lot of focus group research about the more negative attitudes towards disabled people, and the Glasgow Media Group carried out some focus group research, and that found that a very big sample of the British population was surveyed, found that between half and 3/4 of those, most of the people who were surveyed thought that between half and 3/4 of all people on disability benefits were scroungers. So, hold that thought, because that's the kind of what we're up against. And so we also had this year, the news that we had the highest ever number of hate crimes against disabled people reported. And obviously that's to do partly with the fact that more people are reporting, and that's good. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people believe, and I do, is that probably some attacks are increasing because of the disability benefits splash. And that's some of the kind of coverage that we're getting at the moment. That's borrowed from Stephen Brooks from the Disability Hate Crime Network, my great friend, who has done so much again to promote work against disability hate crime. And do join the network, completely free. Simon Green over there, another moderator. We do, it's completely free to everybody, and we try and give advice to disabled people on hate crime. So we have that problem. And one of the reasons why that coverage is a problem is that it taps right into these very, very deep, I think possibly unconscious in some cases, feelings and views about disabled people that have held sway for over 2,000 years. And as Richard said, when I started looking at the history of attitudes towards disability, I was quite surprised what I found, actually, because I'd set out to write a kind of current affairs analysis of disability hate crime as it was, but the publishers had said, "We don't want that, we want you to go back in time and find out where this comes from." And so I did what I had to do, and as I looked at the cases and I looked at the history, I found that a lot of the cases that were happening over the last sort of 5 years since I started investigating disability hate crime, the motivations were shaped by our common history. So you found people being scapegoated as they had been in Greek times. when disabled people, infirm people as they were called in ancient Greek, were expelled from cities because they were seen as carrying a curse. You saw disabled people being treated as kind of witches or as cursed, and that's still happening in Africa today. Young people with epilepsy, for instance, are seen as cursed, and that was happening right back in medieval times. And one of the cases I think that struck both Richard and me that I talked about was a couple of cases in Essex where a one-legged woman called Elizabeth Clark, and this was back in the 1700s, she was the first woman to be accused of witchcraft in this sort of eastern counties, and she sort of kick-started one of the biggest witch hunts in the UK. And I think one of the most poignant things about her case was that she had to be helped to the gallows because she couldn't walk, because she had one leg, and I find that incredibly moving. There was another case that kind of finished our iniquitous history of treating disabled people as witches, which was, again, in Essex, a case of a Frenchman called Dummy, who couldn't see or hear, and he was ducked in a brook and then died of pneumonia in a workhouse later. So we have, that history of witch hunts. We have the kind of idea of the freak show, which is still very, very common today, that disabled people are kind of worthy spectacles. And I found that in a lot of the murders I looked at over the last few years, but it was also there right back in the monster markets in Roman times, so it went right back in history. So I think, as Richard says, because we've never challenged any of those ideas, or we haven't challenged them forcefully enough, when the media started saying that disabled people were scroungers in 2010, those seeds fell on very fertile ground, and so they flourished. And that meant that more disabled people became victims of hate crime. And on the slide 2, you'll recognise a lot of these faces. Fiona Pilkington and her daughter, Christine McKinsky, who was kicked, she was urinated on as she lay dying, and David Askew in the bottom corner, who, like Fiona and her daughter, were harassed and harassed and harassed for several years. And these are the victims of disability hate crime, and unfortunately we keep on having new ones, like Peter Greener, a man with MS, whose condition fluctuated, as it often does with MS, and his neighbour accused him of being a scrounger, and that was the first kind of evidenced case that we had about a year ago, that this kind of campaign of misinformation was having an awful effect on disabled people. Just going back in the history of that campaign, and I do see it as a concerted campaign by the government and certain journalists. It started in June 2010, and we should have heeded that warning. That's when the government launched a crackdown on what they said was disability benefit fraud. And at the time, there were statistics being bandied about saying that 75% of people on incapacity benefit weren't eligible. And the real figure, the government knew this was around 1%. But the government carried on. It launched a spending challenge website and said that they'd like the public to suggest ways of reducing spending on welfare. And almost all the comments on there were about disabled people, and a lot of them were about car parking, actually. And they felt that disabled car parking was absolutely iniquitous. But a lot were really a lot worse. They were suggesting disabled people should be sterilised, going straight back to the Holocaust. They're suggesting even, I found this one quite extraordinary, that people should be sent to Afghanistan as deterrents. And it was really only when the Equality Commission, and Jackie Driver's here somewhere, and I'm sure had a lot to do with this, actually warned the government that they'd passed these comments on to their legal enforcement team, that the Treasury took them down. And that was several days after they'd been up, effectively inciting hatred against disabled people. And no minister has apologised to this day, or emphasise the real benefits, the real figures of disability benefit fraud, and instead this campaign has continued. And to sort of add to it, and I'll sum up soon because there's lots of people to speak, we then had Lord Justice Leveson and his inquiry, which was looking at the ethics of newspaper reporting, and lots of people from the disability movement asked Lord Justice Leveson to consider this absolutely pernicious campaign, and he didn't. you know, we tried really, really hard. Lots of people gave evidence. In fact, I analysed the statistics on the website, and disabled people, just after women, were the biggest group of individual complainees to Lord Justice Leveson, but there wasn't an oral hearing on the disability fraud reporting. He did take some written evidence, but really that wasn't good enough. He took evidence from lots of other equality groups. I think he should have done for disabled people as well. So sort of where we're left really is that we've got the sort of aftermath of the Paralympics and that great kind of feeling that perhaps disabled people will at last be accepted as equal citizens. And you know, only the other night I was watching Channel 4 News and there was a young disabled woman on there talking about motoring. I thought, blimey, we have come a long way. But then at the same time, we're still getting stories like this. So we're living this paradoxical situation, and I think, you know, we need to have some lead from the top. Wouldn't it be great if the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose church house is literally opposite here, perhaps apologised for the role of the church in encouraging hatred against disabled people in the past? But wouldn't it be greater still if our Prime Minister, who's only, you know, a stone's throw from here, actually apologised for this particular campaign? I don't think it's going to happen, but you know, those are my wishes for the kind of legacy of the Paralympics. Thank you, Richard.